the latest in the Illinois governor's race and new precautions at O'Hare in the wake of global concerns about Ebola. These are just a few stories we're discussing with our guest today. Joining me are commentator and blogger Scott Smith, lawyer and writer Lauren Blair, and writer Luis Diaz-Perez. Hello and welcome to you all.
Hi.
Hey. Well, there is never a dull moment in the race for governor. This week we heard allegations that Bruce Rauner may have bullied and threatened a former female CEO in one of the companies he owned, allegations he denies. We also heard allegations that Governor Quinn's anti-violence program that's under investigation right now may have been used to buy votes in the African-American community in the 2010 election. All of this scandal. Scott, how will this play with voters?
Well, I'm not sure that some of the, we're starting to see some of these little stories that come out close to the election that really starts to chip away at different candidates. I don't think you can look at any one of these stories in isolation and draw a conclusion. This lawsuit that was filed against Rauner was eventually thrown out, for example. So what you have to look at is the pattern that evolves from all these stories. You have got Rauner who is looking to be CEO of Illinois rather than governor. He's got this idea that you can come in and shake up Springfield and you can plow right through all the gridlock and what have you. But the problem is the governor's office doesn't really work that way. When you're CEO and you come in new to a company, you can kind of hire and fire and you can clear the decks and bring your own people in. And the problem is that the people of Illinois have hiring and firing responsibility when it comes to the government. So he's going to have to develop a lot more of a compromise style if he thinks he's going to end up in the governor's chair. And I think the voters have to ask whether there's somebody who's got the experience of doing that already, maybe not to the performance that everybody likes, but somebody that at least knows the lay of the land a little bit.
Yeah, speaking of hiring and firing, Lauren, how should voters take a look at this?
Well, the problem I have with the Rauner story involving Christine Kirk, the lawsuit that she brought alleging breach of fiduciary duty and hostile work environment, was really Rauner's response to that. His claim was not that this outsourcing business that he promised to fund failed because of any breach of fiduciary duty or hostile work environment that he propagated, but because Christine Kirk was a rabid spender and that she couldn't do the hard work of the business of increasing revenue and cutting expenses and doing layoffs. And to me, that set off my gender bias radar. It smacked of the 1950s notion that the little lady of the household just loves to go shopping, but it takes a man to run the household and the hard operations. And it makes me question whether this candidate has some of those deep-seated biases as part of his makeup, and is that somebody who I think is going to represent Illinois well?
Luis, does any of this set off any alarms for you?
Well, I think that what the problems that the Rauner campaign is experiencing are reminiscent or resemble a lot of problems that Republicans have had with some of their chief executive candidates, nationally and locally. First of all, we've had financiers or very wealthy people who have no experience in public service wanting to jump in and want to convince voters of their amazingness simply by virtue of the fact that they possess great fortunes. And they haven't been successful so far in statewide races. And we see the same sort of problem in the presidential race with the Republican candidate 2 years ago. 4 years after the onset of the financial crisis, the best the Republicans could come up with was a financier to run for president. And I think that the public is, by and large, not entirely comfortable with someone with that sort of background solely and exclusively running for office without having some truly demonstrated public service record to back them up.
Who would have thought financial success would be a liability, though?
Well, I think that we're looking at the way in which you define financial success and the way that you set up these different kinds of companies, right? The kinds of companies that Rauners typically run are usually ones that look at distressed properties, if you will, distressed industries, come in, use scale in order to build them up, and then they get out. So they're not really interested in a long-term investment in companies. They're interested in kind of coming in, having a short-term success, and then kind of getting out. And that's not necessarily the way that you want to have somebody to look at government. I know he's big on term limits, and he believes that that's how we should look at politics and having a role in politics. But Illinois has got problems. And it really does, it's not going to be a short-term fix. It's going to be something that's going to be long-term. We're starting to see things turn around, but it isn't a short-term fix where you can just, again, kind of come in, clear the deck in a lot of ways. You're really going to have to continue to build on what's already there.
Let's take a look at a recent poll by Reboot Illinois. And it shows that Governor Quinn is pulling ahead of Bruce Rauner by about 4 percentage points, which is above the margin of error here. Now, months ago, Rauner had a 10-point lead over the governor. Lauren, what's going on here? Why the change in voter sentiment?
Well, I think polls, I would first add, are only as good as what goes into selecting the poll constituent. I don't put a lot of stock in polls, but I do think voters do, especially as it gets closer to the election. And my concern is that voters want to vote with the winning candidate. So I'm not sure that the polls are a good indicator of voter sentiment, but I do think voters react to what the media reports that the polls show. So I think that Governor Quinn might have an advantage with this change up in the poll numbers, and that the closer we are to the election, he's in a position of strength. Even though it really is a dead heat, I think that the swing in the percentage in favor of him will get voters thinking that he is the candidate that they will back.
Luis, why the swing?
Well, I think it's to be expected. Bruce Rauner has spent a lot of money, it would seem, raising his name recognition. I think the early poll advantages that he had reflected the money he had spent just in building awareness around his campaign, and they should have anticipated that things would start to even out as we get closer to Election Day. And bear in mind that the governor only won by about 32,000 votes against someone who didn't have much name recognition again 4 years ago. I mean, someone who was at least established politically, but the Republican Party should have seen that he was very vulnerable. I'm a little surprised again why they would present a candidate with this sort of profile to run against Pat Quinn, who has, I think, pretty well established populist credentials. And I think that that's what he's expecting to carry the day for him.
I mean, we are in a season where there is a great deal of dissatisfaction with the way Illinois government is run. Let's also talk about the parade of celebrities campaigning for Governor Quinn. We've had a president, President Obama, his wife. We've had a possible future presidential candidate, Hillary Clinton, and a TV president, Martin Sheen from the West Wing, all campaigning for Governor Quinn in the past week. Scott, does this make a big difference?
Well, it gets, you win the news cycle, right? Like, everybody likes to hear about their favorite TV personality. I mean, Martin Sheen was always been, I think, my favorite president, TV or otherwise. This is keeping the Quinn name associated with folks who have that gravitas, who are, in fact, either very active in politics or have a record that they are able to run on as well. Whether it is a history of progressive issues like Martin Sheen has, or whether it's Hillary Clinton, who certainly has had a number of governmental roles, and so it reinforces the idea that Quinn can handle the governor's chair. He can continue to serve in that role. But this is the time when people are starting to pay attention. It's why you start to see that poll swing back. The We Ask America Reboot Illinois poll is the one that originally did show that Rauner was ahead quite a bit. So now, looking at those same poll results now and having Quinn ahead, I think that really says that people are starting to pay more attention, and as more attention starts to be focused on this race, you do have to kind of bring in your big guns, and that's why you're starting to see a lot of those celebs. It also reinforces the idea that Quinn is that progressive candidate. He's had a lot of problems with progressives because of the unions, and they've been suing him. So this kind of reinforces a lot of the key messages and kind of reminds those folks who their friends really are.
And it would have been noteworthy had a lot of these prominent Democrats not come out in support of Quinn. Republicans would have seized on that as a vulnerability, just as they are probably critical of him for bringing in national figures to support him in a statewide race.
Okay, speaking of Republicans, in other political news, the city's 38th ward, folks there say they're getting robocalls not to get out and vote, but to run for office, to replace Alderman Tim Cullerton, who's retiring in May. Is this, Lauren, resourceful or desperate?
sounds like an act of desperation to me. I understand that they're promising to give support to anybody who's interested in stepping up to the plate for this role and help them be successful in that campaign. But I really question the strategy of casting that kind of net, asking anyone who will be willing to take on the challenge to step into this role. And I really think they could have been more strategic. I'm kind of scratching my head about this strategy.
Scott, you look like you have something to say.
Well, it reminds me of when Mayor Emanuel was sort of posting a help wanted sign for aldermanic candidates that he wanted. It sort of does smack of desperation. It does sort of say, like, you know, we're just looking for a warm body at this point, but we don't really have a strategy. We don't really have an agenda. You know, it's interesting to watch the Chicago and the Illinois GOP really start to try to make inroads into areas where they haven't yet. You know, Rauner has been visiting a Southside credit union and throwing a lot of money around. I don't think that that's going to be something that resonates with voters, because they're ultimately going to look at the background of the people that are bankrolling these efforts, and there is no resonance there. Those kind of issues that they're interested in aren't the issues that voters are really going to sign on for.
Okay, let's move on to a wider issue, the Ebola screening. Hours after the first Ebola death in the United States, O'Hare became one of 5 international airports screening passengers from West Africa for Ebola. Luis, is this a good idea?
Oh, I definitely think so. You know, we've been struggling with plagues and epidemics for centuries. You know, the word quarantine, in fact, comes from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. And travelers coming into ports like Venice were forced to stay for 40 days on islands off the coast to ensure that the city would be free of disease. And you know, Ebola seems to have some very striking and characteristics that make it seem especially dangerous. The 21-day incubation period in particular makes it especially insidious, it would seem, not to mention, of course, the mortality rates associated with it. I think that screening only makes sense as long as it's performed or executed in a humane way. And if we are screening people ahead of time or screening people in the earliest stages, I think that we should be able to manage it and the contact that Americans would have with it. So I would endorse screening, provided it's done in a humane way. It's in keeping with tried and true, in fact, really the only effective ways that society's ever had to manage epidemics and pandemics.
As we saw in Dallas, the screening is only as good as the people doing it. How concerned, Lauren, are you about this screening effort?
Well, I mean, what is the screening? It's my understanding that it's they're going to, for passengers traveling internationally from West African countries, they're going to be filling out a questionnaire and maybe doing some temperature checks, really low evasive type screening. I think it's a good idea because it allows us to track individuals. The concern with outbreak is, how do you know who these individuals are and where they're going? So even if they're not candid in saying whether they've been in contact with somebody who's had Ebola, the authorities are getting their information, and that makes these individuals better able to track, and they're in the country.
All right. We will move on. Some have argued stopping all flights. Scott, is that a good idea, bad idea?
The what?
Some have argued to stop flights from those parts.
You know, I think the more that you close your borders, the more that you actually allow a disease like this to spread. It does not actually do, you know, help people that are in these countries that need our assistance. To close ourselves off actually, you know, makes the problem worse in a lot of ways. I would say that as important as this is, you know, we've seen about 8,000 cases of Ebola, and certainly the mortality rate is high. As a media person, I often wonder about the coverage that's being given to it. You know, it's on CNN all the time. I look at things like heart disease. We lose 600,000 people a year to heart disease. Respiratory diseases, we lose people globally in the millions. I would, you know, look at those stories, and as important as a story like Ebola is to understand the world around us, I just wish that we'd spare some time to some of those other equally, and even some more cases, lethal diseases.
We've got to move on here. The Chicago Fire Festival took place last week. Kind of a flame out, over $1 million in public money. Alderman Burke called it a taxpayer-funded fiasco. Luis, is he right?
Well, he's probably overstating it a little bit. I think, first of all, for Chicagoans, it's probably important for us to sort of reclaim this history, acknowledge the history, embrace it. I don't know why they chose the 143rd anniversary of the Chicago fire to stage a celebration or recognition of it. So I think it was the conception, the idea of recognizing and doing some sort of citywide commemoration of the Chicago fire is important. It should have been done decades ago, and we should have built a tradition into our city around it. However, this particular exhibition had flaws in execution. They probably need to go back to the drawing board on it, but I think it's important for us as Chicagoans to commemorate what was such a significant event in our history and in the nation's
Lauren,
history.
quickly, does it deserve a second chance?
It does, and as long as it does what its promise was, which was community engagement. There were 15 neighborhoods that participated in this festival, and they were neighborhoods like Englewood, Austin, Lawndale. So as long as these communities are engaged in arts and culture in Chicago, communities that may not be able to come downtown and go to the Art Institute or go to the theater at the Goodman, as long as those communities are being reached and served in their communities, I think arts engagement is a wonderful idea and worth the investment in our city.
All right, we'll move on to our last topic today. Robert Morris University has decided that video games are a varsity sport. It's couch potato's dream. I don't know if that's a parent's dream, but clearly this is a competition. But Scott, is this a sport?
I don't know if it's a sport, but it's nice that it's a competition. I think I wish now I would have finally something to let her in. This is seeing colleges look at how to prepare students for the real world, and we may, we still make things with wood and steel, but we also make things with ones and zeros now. And so this is really taking the interest level of people coming in and putting it into an educational program that then also prepares people to think about how they're going to take that, into a job environment.
This is a billion-dollar industry, and it's growing, and it's an industry where these teams can compete for $1 million purses. These teams get paid salaries. There's endorsements, sponsorships. It's a lucrative industry. So I think it makes sense for colleges to give scholarship for this new industry as a career option. And if they can give it for mascots, then I think they can give, they can afford to give some scholarship to the pro gamer industry.
Louise, a quick last word.
I'm not swayed by any of that. I would file this story under world turned upside down. I don't think that it really has any part of an educational experience. It's a recreation that unfortunately a lot of kids spend an inordinate amount of time on. I think this is the university chasing, trying to enhance their admissions appeal, but I don't think it does much for education, for the culture, for kids, for much of anything.
We will leave it there. Thank you so much to our guests, Scott Smith, Lauren Blair, and Luis Diaz-Perez.